Good afternoon. So glad to see you all awake and alert for this lovely presentation on sleep, fatigue, and the provider. So our guest speaker today, Dr. Sujay Kansagra, comes to us from Duke University Medical Center, where he is Associate Professor in the Department of Pediatrics. He is Director of the Pediatric Neurology Sleep Medicine Program and Program Director for the Pediatric Neurology Residency Program. I have to say, and I've said this a few times already, that I'm really glad that he finally landed at Duke, because it seems like for several years he was having a little bit of a struggle between which of the rivals 15 minutes apart that he really was going to align with. Because Dr. Kansagra completed his undergraduate work at UNC Chapel Hill, his medical degree at Duke, his pediatric residency at Chapel Hill, his pediatric neurology residency at Duke, where I am, and then he went back to Chapel Hill to complete his sleep medicine fellowship. And then in 2012, Duke won that rivalry and got him to sign on as faculty in the Department of Pediatrics and the Pediatric Neurology Department. So, go Duke. Dr. Kansagra has published numerous articles, written book chapters, and presented on topics related to neurology, primarily on epilepsy and sleep. He's written 5 books, one on sleep, and the other 4 on topics related to helping the medical student and residency candidate achieve their goals, their various goals. Today, Dr. Kansagra is here to talk with us about how we might recognize the signs and symptoms of sleep deprivation and fatigue, show us how serious it is, and offer some suggestions for what we can do about it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sujay Kansagra.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that introduction. I am thrilled to be here. Everybody hear me okay? I usually talk fairly loud. I love talking about sleep. I don't have a disclosure slide, but my main disclosure is I'm a bit of like a sleep evangelist. Like I go around and I'm like preaching about how great sleep is, and so I'm always excited to talk to anybody that's willing to listen about sleep and how it affects our lives. We lots of objectives. We're going to get a little bit into sleep science. I know this is noontime and you guys are eating lunch, and so I won't delve too much into the science behind sleep physiology, but going through it actually helps us understand a few of the sleep disorders and sleep problems that I'll talk about later. We're going to talk about the range of normal sleep, talk about what happens when we're sleep deprived, figure out ways to recognize sleep issues and how to treat them. And then, if all goes well at the end of this presentation, I'm hoping that I may be able to change some of your perceptions and beliefs about sleep. So I usually like to start with the definition of sleep, and I love this definition because it comes out of a book that was written by a surgeon. Any surgeons in the audience today? No? Okay, great. So I can poke fun at surgeons a little bit. This is a book written in the 1800s, and it says, what is sleep? Sleep is the intermediate state between wakefulness and death. Wakefulness being regarded as the active state of all the animal intellectual functions, and death is that of their total suspension. And for many years, this is what we thought sleep was. You're just kind of in between. You're not really doing anything. You're just a step away from death. Your brain is kind of quiet. And it wasn't until the 1920s when we invented when they invented the EEG that people realized there are a whole host of things going on while we sleep. We go through sleep cycles. Your brain at certain times is actually so active that it looks actually like the wake brain. And so its definition thankfully has changed for most of us. Some surgeons still believe this. They don't like to sleep very much. But for most of us, the definition has changed. And this is the definition I like: a reversible behavioral state of perceptual disengagement from and decreased responsiveness to the environment. So we know we're not completely unresponsive while we sleep. So this is on, okay, sure. So I'll try to stay back here. We're not completely unresponsive because things that you do while you're asleep, even things going on in your environment, you can sometimes incorporate into the sleep state. So if you've ever had that dream where the fire alarm is blaring and it's actually your alarm clock, you've incorporated some of that auditory stimuli into your sleep state. As adults, we toss and turn on the bed throughout the night, but we never fall off of the bed. You do as a kid, but not as an adult, because you maintain some spatial understanding of where you are. So we're not completely unresponsive. And of course, it's a reversible state, thankfully. Why do we sleep? One of the first questions I like to answer. There's no one answer to this question. There are lots and lots of reasons why we sleep, and these are just a few of the things that are out there, a few of the theories. One, it restores our bodies because we have a lot of wear and tear that we do to the machine that is our body throughout the day. And so when you sleep, it's a time for your muscles to kind of relax, repair. You secrete growth hormone during the deepest stages of sleep, so it kind of helps your body restore itself. Now, energy conservation, you don't need to be awake for 24 straight hours to take care of what your body needs to survive. You don't have to be awake to eat, etc. So you do conserve some calories there. Learning, we do a lot of learning while we sleep. We encode many of our short-term memories into our long-term memory stores. Lots of studies show that pulling all-nighters, etc., are terrible for your recall the next day because you do encode a lot of your memories when you're sleeping. We also unlearn while we sleep. So you probably don't remember what you had for dinner 5 nights ago unless it was something just super amazing and you made it yourself. Because you get rid of those memories. You don't need to know all that information, otherwise you just clog up your brain with tons and tons of memories you don't need. So we actually unlearn a lot while we sleep as well. And the last thing I'll mention, although this is not a comprehensive list of why we sleep, but the last interesting thing that we've recently discovered is that sleep also plays a role in actually scrubbing your brain cells clean. When you're asleep, the interstitial fluid, the CSF that surrounds your brain cells, the channels that allows that fluid to wash over your cells increases by about 40%. So it's like the floodgates kind of open up while you're asleep, and it bathes your brain cells in cerebrospinal fluid. And it actually cleans away a lot of toxic proteins that are being built up during the day. In particular, beta amyloid has been found in the animal model, this is a mouse model, to be cleared away during sleep. Beta amyloid plays a role in Alzheimer's disease and we think neurodegenerative disorders. And so so sleep is actually scrubbing your brain cells clean and getting rid of toxic proteins. So another fascinating reason why we sleep. I love this quote. It's from an evolutionary biologist. If sleep does not serve an absolutely vital function, it's the biggest mistake that evolution has ever made, right? Because for 8 hours, you're doing nothing to at least promote your survival. You're not mating, you're not getting calories, you're a sitting duck for predators, right? So if you're a rabbit or something out in the Sahara and you're just sitting there, a lion could just walk up to you and eat you while you're asleep. So it doesn't make sense that we would have this time where we're such at a disadvantage for survival unless it played a huge function in helping us while we were awake to promote our survival. So sleep has got to be important. And it's conserved, right? It's conserved among species. So we talk about why we do sleep. Why don't we sleep? Probably the more important question to ask. Why don't we sleep? Well, there's a lot of stuff going on. We have very active lives, work, family, and sleep. It's hard to balance. It's not really a priority, right, in most people's lives, unfortunately. There's a Sleep in America poll that happens every year. And they gave folks an option of 5 things and say, what do you prioritize most in your life? And interestingly, fitness and nutrition came up at 35%, which was kind of surprising. 27% said they prioritize work the most. 17% said they prioritize hobbies and interests. 10% said sleep. 9% said social life. These are only 5 choices they had. But we beat out social life, but it's still pretty low when it comes to the overall priority list. And a lot of that has to do with our cultural perceptions regarding sleep. And I love this. This is straight out of an admissions packet from Duke. It says basically there are 3 S's in your life: study, socialize, and sleep. At Duke, you get to pick 2 of them. Most of us give up sleep. Apply now, Duke University, admissions, right? I mean, this is kind of like, look how cool we are. We don't sleep, we sit around with our, the no shoes on wicker furniture. This is a place to be. And I actually, when I saw this, I emailed the admissions department. I said, why are you promoting not sleeping at our school? I kind of take offense to this as a sleep doctor. And they're like, oh, we'll change it. We'll take it out. And I haven't seen it since. But this is a culture regarding sleep. It's kind of one of those, it's an easy kind of whipping boy, right? It's a little target. And I get it. And in medicine in particular, we don't have a nice relationship with sleep. And you can think to your own personal history and think to yourself, when is the last time you went up to a colleague and you're like, got that 8.5 hours last night, I feel fantastic today. Versus, oh God, I really struggled. I only slept 4 hours because I had to knock out this paper and this grant, but I'm going to make it through this day. You kind of wear the sleep deprivation as kind of like a badge of honor. Like, look how hard I'm working. Look how dedicated I am to what I'm doing. And I tell people to try to reverse that, because when you're sleep deprived, you are not your best self. You're not working as well as you could. You're at higher risk of injuring yourself and injuring others. And so I say, don't be proud of the sleep deprivation. I want you to feel a little bit ashamed of sleep deprivation. That's my goal, because it's not great for your body and for those around you. Okay, that's really my overarching goal in this talk. And I may be the only one that tells you this for the rest of your life, because there are not many people that are like sleep evangelists. Okay, so I'm the only voice of reason that you may hear regarding sleep. All right, so I got to be convincing. Let's talk a little bit about the science. The science behind sleep. I love this slide because it pretty much tells you why you feel the way that you feel throughout the day. There are two main things that are going on in your brain that make you feel awake and sleepy at different times of the day. The one at the top, the homeostatic sleep drive, think of the blue arrows that you see here. This is over a 24-hour period, 9 a.m. to 9 a.m. the next day. Sorry, you can't see the time here all that well. And of course, day and night. When you sleep, there are various metabolites that are, when you're awake, there are various metabolites that are building up due to the breakdown of ATP, etc. Those metabolites actually have receptors, and your brain binds those receptors, and it tells you how long you've been awake. It tells your brain, I've been awake for 6 hours, I've been awake for 8 hours, etc. So, as the day goes on, more and more of those metabolites build up, and imagine the bigger the blue arrow, the more sleepy you should feel, because you have more of those metabolites. When you fall asleep, your brain churns through those metabolites, such that by the morning, if you slept enough, you start off at the same level of those metabolites as you did the day prior, completely cleaning your brain free of all the metabolites that have built up. That's called the homeostatic sleep drive. Pretty straightforward. The longer you're awake, the more sleepy your brain feels. But that's not exactly how you feel, right? You don't just feel sleepier and sleepier and sleepier and then crash. And that's because the second process that helps you stay awake is your circadian alerting signal. It's part of the circadian rhythm. I could talk to you all day about the circadian rhythm because it's a fascinating thing. It's every living thing on this planet has a circadian rhythm, down to unicellular organisms. A circadian rhythm is a roughly 24-hour body clock, and it does a variety of things. One thing that it does when it comes to sleep physiology, it produces an alerting signal, but it does a whole host of other things. I could take one white blood cell out of your body, analyze the proteins that are being expressed, and tell you exactly where you are on your circadian day, where your body clock is. Because even down to the cellular level, we actually have translation of a good chunk of our genome in a circadian fashion. More proteins at certain times of the day, less proteins at other parts of the day. We think organ systems have their own circadian rhythm. We know that the lungs, likely the diameter of various airway passages, increases and decreases at different times of the day. And that might play a role as to why asthma symptoms tend to get worse at nighttime. The liver metabolizes drugs differently depending on the time of the day that it sees those medications. So the circadian rhythm is fascinating, and if you invite me back, I'll talk all day about the circadian rhythm. But for the purpose of this lecture, we'll talk about the alerting signal, the wakefulness that it produces for you. Everybody has this up and down pattern. The up and down pattern is similar, although it can occur if you can shift the entire block of yellow arrows to left and the right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the main thing to know is that when you wake up in the morning, the circadian rhythm alerting signal is still fairly low. It starts to rev up by mid to late morning, which is nice. It helps you get a little bit more energy, a little bit more pep in your step. It takes a dip right about now, around 12, 1, 2 o'clock. And everybody blames lunch. I just had a big lunch, I'm sleepy, but it's not the lunch. That's your natural circadian rhythm. It does that for everybody, regardless of whether you ate lunch or not. Even if you didn't eat lunch, you're gonna feel tired right about now. That's a normal part of sleep physiology. We don't know why that dip exists. Perhaps it was an advantage when we're outside all day to have a quiet time where you're taking a little nap when the sun is at its peak, right? When it's really hot outside, who knows? But unfortunately that dip exists and we all have to kind of struggle through it. And then the circadian rhythm, the alerting signal, revs up really nicely later on in the evening time, such that it's at its peak signal right before you tend to fall asleep, which is really nice because what the circadian rhythm has done for you is that it's helped keep you awake during a time where your homeostatic drive is telling you should be getting really sleepy. And it works so effectively that when you go home, you may feel as awake as you'll feel the entire day in the evening hours. So you may think to yourself, I'm really struggling right about now. I'm really trying to stay awake and listen to you, but it's a struggle. And yet, when you go home this afternoon, you're like, I feel pretty good. Maybe I'm not so sleep deprived. But that's because your circadian rhythm is helping you out. That's helping you stay awake. And then thankfully, the circadian rhythm drops rather precipitously when it's time to go to sleep. It does it on its own. You don't have to really do anything to do it. It's always running in the background in the 24-hour loop. And it stays really low through the rest of the night. And helps keep you asleep until morning time. So those are the two things that are at work, helping you feel the way that you feel throughout the day. And for those of you that are used to those, 30-hour, 48-hour call shifts, you know that when you start in the morning and you have a long day, you're feeling, kind of tired, you hit a wall right around 2 or 3 o'clock at night where you're like, this call night is really getting long. And then by the time morning comes and you're ready to round again, if you've been up for 30 hours straight or 24 hours straight, you feel that sense of energy again, and you can make it through rounds. And that's because the circadian alerting signal is kicking back in and giving that extra energy to then be coherent and finish your day. So that's the two process model. Now I'm going to go through a couple of myths that I oftentimes hear, or things that you might believe yourself about sleep, and try to dispel some of those myths. So people often say, well, I don't need the amount of sleep you tell me I need. I only need 6 hours and I'm going to do fine. This is just a breakdown of what folks need to feel fully refreshed. And it is a range. Everybody has a different set point as far as their biologic sleep need. But by the time you hit adulthood, it's 7 to 9 hours. It's not 6 to 7, it's not 6 to 8, it's 7 to 9 hours for the average adult. And if you look at huge epidemiologic studies, on average, the adults need about 8.1 to 8.2 to feel fully refreshed. So it's more than many people believe, but that's really what the science shows. And unfortunately, the older we get, the less we're napping here in our Western society. Most kids will get rid of their naps between the ages of 3 and 5. The younger you are, the more sleep you need, but once you hit adulthood, your overall sleep need for a 24-hour day decreases very, very little. You really continue to need that 7 to 9 hours well into your golden years. So. Now there are exceptions. So 7 to 9 hours is where 97% of the population will fall. But we do have folks on the fringes that are short sleepers and long sleepers. Long sleepers are the folks that naturally need 10 or 11 or more hours to feel fully refreshed. And unfortunately, our society, sleepiness is oftentimes synonymous with laziness. These people are labeled as like lazy. Oh, you don't want to get out of bed, you're always trying to sleep. But that's just the genetic hand they've been dealt. So everybody has a different set point. I try to convince my wife that I need an extra hour more than she does, and that's just a genetic thing. She doesn't believe it. It's hard to convince your bed partner, even if you're a sleep expert. But that's the nature of the genetics. That's the nature of genetics. Thankfully, for some of you, on the other side, short sleep time, which is very advantageous for medicine and lots of other things, so there are folks that naturally need only 4 or 5 or 6 hours to feel fully refreshed. It tends to run in families because there is a genetic polymorphism associated with short sleep time. These folks that can get by consistently on 5 or 6 hours, feel fully refreshed when they wake up. They don't need any caffeine. They don't feel this dip at noontime. And they tend to be actually very positive and energetic people. And these families tend to be just very positive, energetic, and very productive. So you may know some people like this. But they are short sleepers, and that's the genetic hand. There are famous short sleepers. Benjamin Franklin was a short sleeper. Leonardo da Vinci used to practice this thing called polyphasic sleep, where he would sleep for 90-minute cycles or 3-hour cycles and would have a total of 6 hours to a 24-hour day. And he thought that he cracked the code for sleep. He could get an extra hour or two in his day by practicing polyphasic sleep. But in actuality, he was probably just a short sleeper, so he could get away with 6 hours continuously. I have medical students tell me all the time that they've tried polyphasic sleep. They've tried to sleep in 90-minute chunks 4 times a day in hopes of finding that magical hour or two, and they crash and burn almost every single time because they're just not short sleepers, so they can't do it. Navy SEALs are actually trained out to find folks that can optimize their performance with short sleep time. They are trained out to be short sleepers because you want your Navy SEALs to be able to operate in their really stressful, sleep-deprived conditions and still do great. So most Navy SEALs are also selected out for short sleep time. Madonna is thought to be a short sleeper. Bill Clinton notoriously would sleep like 4 or 5 hours. But even short sleepers have their limits, right? This is Bill Clinton during a talk. If you're getting less than what your body needs, you're going to have the effects of sleep deprivation, no matter where your set point is. All right, so how many of you feel like maybe you needed 8 hours when you were younger, but now you've gotten accustomed to sleeping like 6 or 7 hours every night, and you feel like that's fine, I can get by on less? Any takers on that? You've gotten accustomed to less sleep? We usually have a few takers on that. How many people think you can do it? How many people think you can train your body to get by on less sleep? Anybody? No one wants to take me up on that? Well, you would have been right either way, regardless of how you answered, because you can get accustomed to sleep deprivation subjectively. If you are sleep deprived for a long period of time, it becomes your body's new normal. So you begin to say, oh yeah, I feel fine. I feel okay. I'm not sleep deprived. Because you forgot what wakefulness feels like, sadly. But objective testing shows the exact opposite. I'm going to show you some data behind that. But what happens with chronic sleep deprivation? So this, again, goes back to blue arrows that I showed you. Those blue arrows that signify your homeostatic drive. The longer you're awake, the sleepier you feel. And I've condensed it over 3 days, ups and downs, depending on when you're awake and when you're sleepy. And I've arbitrarily given them numbers. The higher the number, the sleepier you are, okay? So you start off your morning on day 1, you start off at a level 1, the lowest level of sleepiness. As the course of the day progresses, you build up those metabolites and you add 3, okay, of metabolites. You're at a level 4 sleepiness. You go to bed and you decide, you know what, I'm going to get up after 6 hours, even though you need 8 hours. And so the next morning, because you haven't gotten rid of all those metabolites in your brain, you already start off with a little bit of a fog in the morning, a little bit of sleepiness in the morning. So you start off at a 2. And then you build 3 on top of that, just like you did the day before. You're going to have to build 3 on top of it every single day. So now you work your way all the way up to level 5 by the end of the day. You fall asleep and you decide you're going to skimp again. Now you're starting off at a level 3 sleepiness. These are folks that wake up with that fog. They're like, waking up is painful. I need my coffee to really get going. That's because you still have a lot of those metabolites swimming around in your brain that you should have gotten rid of while you slept. And this can continue to compound over time. That's the concept of sleep debt. You have to pay back what you have not given your brain when it comes to sleep. So it's a very real concept, and it's all driven by the homeostatic sleep drive. Thankfully, you don't have to pay back that debt one for one. Otherwise, many of you would be sleeping the rest of your lives to pay it back because of the work that you've done. But you do need to have prolonged time in bed consistently to over time pay off some of that sleep debt to get back to your true abilities when it comes to your brain's cognitive abilities. So what happens when we build up sleep debt? This is probably the best controlled study that we have that put a group of people in 4 different conditions, 4 different sleep-deprived conditions. And this is over the course of 2 weeks, so 14 days. And what they had these folks do is at baseline, before they put them in any of these conditions, they said, let's see how good you are at paying attention for a prolonged period of time, a prolonged attention task. It's called the psychomotor vigilance task. They sat them in front of a computer, they gave them a little clicker, and they said, every time you see a red dot flash on that screen, just hit the clicker. That's all you have to do. And it was about, over the course of like 10, 15 minutes, it was about 100 times they had to click the button. And they figured out what their baseline performance was. If it took them more than half a second to click the button, it was considered a miss. You missed that red dot. And half a second is a long time when it comes to just looking at something and then hitting a button to respond to it. You should be able to do it in less than half a second. So everybody got their own baseline measure, and then they put them in 4 different groups. And they compared their performance to their own baseline. They were their own internal controls in this experiment to see how much worse they performed when they were put in sleep-deprived conditions. So their baseline on this graph is their 0 scale. This is the amount of times they missed compared to their own baseline of 0 in different sleep-deprived conditions. One group, the green line here, the 0 hours TIB. TIB is time in bed. They allowed them to have 0 hours time in bed for 3 straight days. You can't really do this experiment more than 3 straight days, right? So IRB is not going to be happy with you. So for 3 straight days, they got 0 sleep. And after day 1, on average, they were missing that dot about 8 times more than their own baseline. On day 2, about 13 times more than their own baseline. Again, this is out of about 100 attempts. So if they had missed 15 at baseline, they were missing 28. And then by day 3, they were missing it 15 to 16 times more than their own baseline, which makes sense. I mean, they haven't gotten any sleep for 3 straight days. You're going to be doing worse. Makes sense. The other 3 groups, they allowed to do it the whole 2 weeks worth. Okay, there was a 4-hour time in bed group, a 6-hour, and an 8-hour. The 4-hour time in bed group, as the study progressed, did worse and worse and worse compared to their own baseline, such that by the end of the study at 2 weeks, they were missing about 15 to 16 more than their own baseline, which is the same performance as somebody that had been sleep deprived for 3 straight days. So pretty poor performance. The 6-hour time in bed group, so I'm hopeful that not many of you are doing 4 hours continuously, but 6 hours some of you may be doing. The 6-hour time in bed group also continued to worsen in a linear fashion throughout the course of the study, such that at the end of the 2 weeks, they're performing at the same level, so missing about 12, as somebody that had been sleep deprived somewhere between 1 and 2 straight days, okay, continuously. So pretty poor performance. And you can see with these graphs here, there's no signs of plateauing. It's pretty linear. It's a pretty linear worsening. So who knows if you extended this all the way out here to like 3 or 4 weeks, how poorly they would be doing. They might be getting to the extent where they're performing just as badly as somebody that had been sleep deprived for 3 straight days. And the group that was supposed to serve as kind of the control was the 8-hour time in bed group. And their performance over time also continued to worsen slightly, which Could be multiple factors. They could just be getting bored with the experiment, certainly, and missing stuff, granted. But there's likely also an element of sleep deprivation even in this group, because 8 hours time in bed does not equate to 8 hours time asleep. None of us are asleep 100% of the time when we're laying in bed. And so they were likely slowly sleep depriving themselves as well, and also seem to increase in a somewhat linear fashion. Again, it can be lots of other factors, but interesting to see that, there is no plateau effect when it comes to objective testing. This same group, they had them subjectively say how sleepy they felt. And the 4 and the 6 hour time in bed group didn't have much differences. And over time, their reports plateaued to the point they're saying, nah, I don't feel that much worse than I did a few days prior. So they didn't feel sleepier, and yet their brains were kind of getting slower and slower, which is a bad combination, right? If you think you feel fine, but you're really not doing so great. So that's a fun little interesting study. And that's great, you might say, but I have the magic potion, right? You can just caffeinate your way out of sleepiness. So let's talk a little bit about what caffeine does. These are the blue arrows again. We keep going back to the blue arrows because it all goes back to sleep science. The blue arrows, you're building up that drive on a normal day from in the morning to night. You build up that drive nicely. I told you that one of the substances that it's building up is adenosine from the breakdown of ATP. We have adenosine receptors in our brains. The adenosine receptors bind the adenosine and tell you about how long you've been awake. Caffeine actually prevents the adenosine from binding to the adenosine receptors. That's what it's doing. It's just playing a trick on in your brain saying, you actually haven't been awake that long after all. There's not that much adenosine floating around. It's just a temporary trick that caffeine plays. It doesn't do anything to get rid of that sleep drive. I wish it did, but it doesn't dissipate the sleep drive. Your adenosine is still there, floating around, just waiting until your body churns through that caffeine, which it does eventually, and then it's ready to bind to those receptors. So nothing tricks the brain. Nothing tricks your brain. Your brain always knows, okay? Your brain's very smart. It always knows, and then once your body churns through that caffeine, you kind of end up at the same place you would have anyway, right? You end up with a pretty high homeostatic drive. And this is mostly true, but I tell people, depending on when you consume the caffeine, you might still have some caffeine in your system when you're going to bed at night. So if you're consuming it in the late, afternoon, evening, we churn through about half the caffeine in our system every 4 to 7 hours. That's the half-life for caffeine. So even caffeine that you drink in the morning, there's likely a little bit of it still floating around in your system when it's time to sleep at night. So something to think about. When I did my sleep fellowship, I was also treating adults, and some of the most elderly of my patients would come in and say, I just can't sleep at night, I feel really restless. The older you get, the slower you tend to metabolize caffeine. And the first thing I did was I'd cut their 2 cups of coffee in the morning out of their routine. I said, let's just switch to decaf. Just humor me on this. Let's switch to decaf and let's see what happens. They'd come in the next visit and be like, it was my morning caffeine that was keeping me up at night. I can't believe it. And they do great. So caffeine is not as benign as we may think. So medical training, right? We have just this love-hate relationship when it comes to sleep. And I'd like to take you a little bit through the historical perspective on this to figure out why exactly sleepiness and working so hard and sacrificing sleep is seen as such a crucial element to our medical education. William Osler, the founder, the father of modern medicine, he started the first residency program at Hopkins. And William Stewart Halstead was also with him at Hopkins. They were 2 of the big 4 that started, Hopkins education. William Stewart Halstead was in charge of the surgery program. He heavily influenced William Osler, who started the first medicine program. And William Osler's model kind of then permeated throughout, medical training, because they started residency, modern residency. William Stewart Halstead was a workhorse. He was a surgeon, but he was a workhorse. He made contributions to the surgical world that you wouldn't believe. And he expected the same of his residents. You work, you work, you work. And so back then, residents in the Hopkins program were residents, right? And it continued in many programs. You were a resident of the hospital. That's why they called you residents. So you lived there, and you stayed there day and night. If you could find somebody to take care of your patients on Sunday afternoon, you got to leave the hospital for Sunday afternoon. And if you didn't, too bad, you were in the hospital. So there were no duty hours rules back then. So they expected a lot. And William Stewart Halstead's kind of his push for contributing, for working, sacrificing sleep was well known. And we think he heavily influenced William Osler. But Dr. Halstead had a little bit of some help when it came to his work ethic. He was addicted to cocaine. He was known to be addicted to cocaine. It wasn't illegal back then, so to his credit, and he got addicted because he volunteered to be a part of an anesthesia experiment where he got a little taste and then couldn't stop. But he used cocaine for likely the majority of his career, and that may have driven some of this work ethic. Now we're all expected to have the same work ethic, but using cocaine is frowned upon. I truly believe that some of like the ethos behind the medical training and working so hard probably has its start in cocaine. That's just my perspective. I wanted to do a little something with you guys. Is I want to calculate all of your own sleep numbers. There is an Epworth Sleepiness Scale. It's a subjective scale, so I'm going to have each of you do this on your own. You don't have to share your number. I'm going to walk you through 8 different scenarios, and I want you to, in your head, calculate your chances of dozing off in each of those scenarios. You can give each scenario one of 4 scores, a 0, 1, 2, or 3, depending on the chances of dozing off. A 0 means no chance of dozing off at all. A 1 is a slight chance, 2 is a moderate chance, and 3 is a high chance that you doze off. And by doze off, I don't mean like a full-fledged nap and you're drooling. I just mean like you're kind of like doing that little, that little nod kind of a thing. What are the chances that you might have that experience in these scenarios? If you want to write it down, fine. If you want to keep track of it in your head, no problem. So scenario 1 is if you're sitting and reading. Give yourself a score: 0, 1, 2, or 3. Okay? 0 is no chance, 1 is mild chance, 2 is a medium chance, 3 is a high chance. And now keep adding it to the next scenario, okay? So that's scenario 1, sitting and reading. Scenario 2, watching television. What are your chances of dozing off? Scenario, and again, you kind of have to average it. It depends on what show you're watching, right? I mean, if you're watching, some paint dry, you're gonna, but on average, what are your chances of you're just sitting around with your family watching TV? What are the chances you'll doze off? Scenario 3, sitting inactive in a public place, like this, for example. A couple you should answer 3 because I've seen you doze off. I'm just kidding. So 0, 1, 2, or 3, sitting inactive in a public place. Scenario 4, if you're a passenger in a car for an hour without a break, what are the chances? Let me know if I'm going too fast. Scenario 5, laying down to rest in the afternoon when circumstances permit. And again, if this doesn't happen to you, just imagine that it has happened to you. What are your chances of dozing? Scenario 6, sitting and talking to somebody. And keep adding up the scores as you're getting them. Scenario 7 is sitting quietly after lunch without alcohol. The alcohol is critical there. And then the last scenario is if you're in a car that's stopped in traffic for just a few minutes. The question doesn't specify whether you're driving or not, but, and that's probably intentional, so you'll have to decide whether you're driving or not. But a car that's stopped in traffic for just a few minutes. Everybody got their score? Now we're going to see what those scores mean, okay? So the interpretation, this is a widely used scale when it comes to research for sleep and clinically. If you score between 0 and 7, it's unlikely that you have abnormal sleep or you're abnormally sleepy. As 8 to 9 on this scale, based on the metrics they have, they feel like it's an average amount of daytime sleepiness. 10 to 15, you may be excessively sleepy depending on the situation. You may want to consider seeking medical attention. And then 16 to 20 is you are excessively sleepy and should strongly consider seeking medical attention. And let me put that also in the medical frame of reference here. This is a study that looked at various different subjects. A normal population, they scored about a 6. Insomniacs, because they have a hard time falling asleep, scored about a 2. Sleep apnea scores about a 12 if you have sleep apnea. If you're a medical resident, you score about a 15. Worse than sleep apnea. And then narcolepsy, who are just about as sleepy as you can get, score about an 18. So medical residents are somewhere between sleep apnea and narcolepsy when it comes to level of sleepiness, which many residents will probably believe. This was right before the first duty hours iteration, but I'm sure that much of this actually still stands because duty hours hasn't really done what we're hoping to do when it comes to increasing sleep time. So why are we so sleepy in the medical field? Plenty of reasons. You're on call, so you don't have time to sleep. You have fragmented sleep because you're getting paged throughout the night. You can have circadian rhythm disruption. So if you're asked to do night flow and your body clock is lined up completely differently, that causes problems with sleep. And then you can have a primary sleep disorder like sleep apnea and insomnia. This is a hypnogram. This takes you through the various stages of sleep over the course of an entire night. REM, stage 1, stage 2. 3 and 4 we actually now combine into like stage 3 as deep sleep. But you should go through cycles every 90 minutes. The first part of the night, you're supposed to spend a lot of good time in deep sleep. Second part of the night, a lot more time. These black bars are REM sleep. That's how a normal night should look in an ideal situation. If you were to get 10 pages throughout the course of the night, fairly evenly spaced, this is how your hypnogram will likely look. You're spending hardly any time in deep stages. Your REM sleep is very fragmented, and you're just having a poor overnight quality of sleep, and then boom, morning rounds hits, and you have to go and be coherent. So it really destroys your sleep architecture and the normal cycles that you're supposed to be getting through. So what does that result in? A sleep-deprived resident or faculty or any sleep-deprived human being, it affects almost everything that you do, okay? If you have a sleep problem, it worsens just about every other social, psychiatric, medical condition that you can imagine. So workplace becomes difficult. Your mood and performance are strongly linked to how well you sleep. Your professionalism can take a little bit of a hit if you're sleep deprived. Relationships at home, of course, can be a problem. Your overall health and well-being. Driving safety, which we'll talk a lot more about in just a bit, can be a big issue for our trainees. And then learning. You don't learn as well when you're sleep deprived. Who's at risk? What are the specialties most likely to report experiencing sleep deprivation? Probably no surprise, neurosurgery. They've carved out an exception to the duty hours rule for neurosurgeons. They get to work 80 hours, just was not enough to get the job done, so they have a higher duty hours limit. So neurosurgery is actually number 1, reporting signs of sleep deprivation. General surgery is number 2. Orthopedic surgery is number 3. We see a little bit of a trend here. The people that are standing over you while your body is split open are the ones that are the most sleep deprived, which is crazy and sad. But then some that might surprise you. Neurology comes in at number 4, OBGYN 5, and actually pediatrics comes in at number 6 for sleepiness. So when I give this talk to my pediatrics department every year, I remind them that even in peds, where we think the schedule is not as taxing, it turns out it is. But people say that's great. We are a self-selected group in medicine, right? We likely function fine off of sleep deprivation. We can still perform at our best. And unfortunately, the data, again, shows that that's not quite true. This was a fun little study where they had folks tracking a moving object on a screen with the mouse, just to see how well they could track it. And they established the person's mean performance, and they put that as a level 1. And then they looked to see how that performance changed the longer they were awake. So after about 21, 22, 23 hours, their performance began to suffer such that they were doing about 6% worse, 94% of what they were doing at their own baseline, one. And then they gave them, interestingly, their performance actually then started to improve at the 29-hour mark. And this is all due to the robust effect of your circadian rhythm that kicks back in the morning time. So fascinatingly, it shows that, yeah, you suffer, but the circadian rhythm kind of helps you out. You're likely not getting back to 100% if you're awake for that long, but it does kind of help you the next morning. But you can see that this is a problem, right? When you're up for 22, 23 straight hours, you're performing at about 94% of what your baseline is on this motor tracking task. They then gave these subjects alcohol, and they were checking the blood alcohol content at different levels, and then seeing where they performed on this tracking task. And at around 0.08, which is the legal driving limit, they were performing at about 94% of their baseline. The same performance they had when they were sleep deprived for about 21, 22, 23 straight hours. So sleepiness can, in some ways, mimic the deficiencies you experience when it comes to this specific task, as alcohol does to your brain. And there are lots of studies that show that sleepy driving does have the same risks in certain situations as drunk driving. If you're a resident that reports sleeping less than 5 hours, how do you compare to those reporting sleeping more than 5 hours per night? These are odds ratios for a whole host of bad things that can happen. And this was kind of a nice paper that they sent out surveys to, it was over 5,000 residents across all different specialties. They got about 3,000 responses. It shows that they really are at risk if they're reporting minimal sleep. And in that same study, they also had them bend into different amounts of sleep and how they experienced their training program. So whether there are reports of stress, there are reports of how well they learned, self-impairment, and feeling belittled and humiliated by their superiors. The more sleep you got, the better they felt they did with learning, and the less they reported all these bad things: stress, self-impairment, and feeling belittled and humiliated. And the opposite is true for the folks that slept really little. They had poor scores across the board. I know when I'm sleepy. That's another thing that people often say. Well, I know when I'm unsafe to do a procedure, I'm unsafe to get behind the wheel. These are some of the warning signs that may make you think, well, maybe you are a little bit more sleepier than you think. If you fall asleep at a conference on rounds, I tell people that if you're falling asleep during my talk and you think I'm boring, you shouldn't necessarily fall asleep. You should just sit there bored if I'm boring you. That's what we do when we're bored, right? You don't actually fall asleep when you're bored. You just sit there bored. If you're falling asleep, it's a sign that you have a problem with the quality or quantity of your sleep. It's pretty clear and simple. So if you find yourself dozing off during the day when you don't want to be, it's not because you're bored. It's because you have a problem with your sleep. If you're feeling irritable with staff, colleagues, family, and friends, maybe it's not everybody else, maybe it's you. That could be the problem. If you have to check your work repeatedly, if you have difficulty focusing on the care of your patients, and if you feel like you just don't care, apathy is one of those early markers of sleep deprivation. You just start feeling like you don't really care so much anymore. You don't have that oomph to go out there and take care of your patients. Residents are unfortunately subjected to lots of sleep experiments. So this is another experiment on residents when it came to sleepiness. The MSLT, the multiple sleep latency test, is a daytime test we use to objectively determine how sleepy you are. And what we have folks do is at 2-hour intervals, so 10 a.m., noon, 2, 4, and 6, we have subjects come into the sleep lab, we hook them up to an EEG, put them in a nice dark room, lay them in a comfortable bed, and say, I'm going to turn the lights off. I want you to go to bed as fast as you can. Let's see how fast you fall asleep. And you do 5 naps. And then you average how long it took them to fall asleep for those 5 naps. If it takes them under 8 minutes to fall asleep on average, it's considered pathologic sleepiness. That's kind of our cutoff for pathologic sleepiness. If it takes them more than 10 minutes to fall asleep during the day, that's considered normal. And between 8 and 10 minutes is kind of the gray zone, but we're not quite sure whether it's pathologic or not. So what they did is they had residents go through this nap test to figure out how, on average, where they fell when it came to the different naps. And so, and they had it divvied out by the time of the day they took the naps. If they allowed them, this line here is how many minutes on average it took for each nap after they had an extended period to sleep in. Okay, and they did pretty well. They stayed above this. This is the 8-minute cutoff here. For every nap attempt on average, it took them more than 8 minutes for this group. The square boxes here are just their baseline, just a regular day where they went in there and took a snap test. They were consistently below the 8-minute mark, just on average. So residents on average, as their baseline, are pathologically sleepy. That's not a surprise. And then post-call, of course, they did a little bit worse. They were actually even more sleepy than they were at their baselines. All that makes sense. Residents are sleepy people. That's what this study shows. But the interesting part is, after every nap attempt, they asked the resident, hey, when you were in there for the last 20 minutes, did you fall asleep during that nap? You should know, right? It's your brain. You were in there resting. You should know that you fell asleep. Did you fall asleep? And so out of all the residents, out of all the naps, on 90 episodes, the residents actually walked out of that room after 20 minutes and said, nope, I was awake that whole time. I know I was awake. I didn't fall asleep. And they were wrong, based on our EEG, which doesn't lie, they were wrong 76% of the time. They're like, I didn't fall asleep, and they'd actually fallen asleep. Which is scary, right? In fact, you're falling asleep and don't know it. Which is scary when it comes to, again, being a surgeon or driving at home. Not knowing how sleepy you are, or not even knowing that you fell asleep, is a really concerning thing. So, a fascinating study. So you don't really know. If you take the general population, so how sleepy are we? And the thing I like to focus on are the things that put us most at risk of problems, which is driving is the most dangerous thing you guys are going to do today. The general population in America reports about 60% of adult drivers say that they've driven while feeling drowsy within the past year. More than a third say they've actually fallen asleep behind the wheel at some point in their lives. And of those that say that they've nodded off, 13% of them say they do it once a month. Once a month. Like, we are on the road with a bunch of zombies, I truly believe, because 3 or 4% of people say that they're doing this every month, which is frightening. This is the general population. We're not even talking about our sleep-deprived residents, who are much more sleepy than the general population. The National Highway Safety Administration, they conservatively estimate that 100,000 police-reported crashes are due to fatigue and sleep. This number continues to increase with more detailed and more specific studies that we have. And it causes lots of deaths, lots of injuries, and it's not just limited to cars. The Exxon Valdez oil spill was thought to be related to fatigue, third mate that was at the wheel when the issue happened. There have been a couple of commuter train derailments up north that are blamed on the driver actually falling asleep. One of them had untreated sleep apnea, fell asleep, and went around a curve at 70 miles per hour and killed multiple people. And this is a picture of Maggie. This is where Maggie's thought comes from. She was in her 20s driving in New Jersey when somebody that had been awake for 24 straight hours fell asleep behind the wheel, crossed the median, hit her head on, and killed her. In New Jersey, before this accident happened, if you killed somebody when you were asleep behind the wheel, it was a misdemeanor, and you had like a $1,000 fine or something like that. Now, because this law was passed, if they can prove you've been awake for 24 straight hours and you get an accident due to your fatigue, then you're charged with vehicular homicide that comes with up to a 10-year jail sentence and about $100,000 in fines. So this is a law in New Jersey, but it's a state-by-state kind of decision, and most states don't have drowsy driving laws. But it's very interesting because, when I gave this talk at Rutgers in New Jersey, and I told them, I said, how do you guys deal with this? Because when you're charting in a electronic medical record, they can easily prove that you've been awake because you're always charting, you're always doing it. They can go easily, lawyers can go back and prove that. And they didn't even know about the law. They're like, oh, well, Maggie's law, nobody told us about that. So it's a concern. And I'm hoping there'll be more of a push, because I think this is the kind of legislation we need to really open up people's eyes to the fact that sleepiness is dangerous, and we've got to be held accountable at some point. For residents, when it comes to vehicle stuff, a lot more dangerous than the general population. This is at Mayo training. They asked their residents, during your training, your 3 or 4 years here, what happened, and 11% of them reported that they were involved in a car crash. 43% said they had a near-miss motor vehicle crash. 20% said they fell asleep while driving. 17% they fell asleep while stopped in traffic. So, of course, it's a real problem. This is just one training institution, but sleepiness behind the wheel is a problem. And every time I give this talk, when I give it in front of like a group of residents, I always have one person come up to me and share just the saddest stories. These are young, healthy people. Like one of my good friends, I gave this talk to the adult neurology team at Duke, and she came up to me and she goes, I have a friend who was a resident who had just had a child. So a resident that has just had a child is probably the highest risk of injury out of any human being on the planet, I think. This poor woman decided to take a lunch break to drive home to see her child, fell asleep behind a wheel, car accident, cervical spine injury, and now she's quadriplegic and confined to a wheelchair. Just the saddest cases, and it's completely preventable and avoidable. So that's why I really drive home the message, you gotta be safe behind the wheel, it's so important. Duty hours. I am not a duty hours expert, okay, so I'm not gonna delve into the duty hours debate, but I will tell you that we thought this was gonna help people sleep more, and it's not really doing that. Duty hours, just because we limit the amount of time in the hospital, does not equate to more sleep time, unfortunately. So it's not the answer to getting more sleep, because you can do whatever you want to when you're at home, right? And residents opt to, they have Netflix and smartphones and lots of things that are vying for their attention and limiting their sleep. So, now, what can you do to become an expert sleeper? Let me give you some practical tips that you can hopefully use yourself, you can tell your trainees, you can tell your family about. Step 1, we'll do it step by step, 4 steps. The first step is practicing good sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene is anything that's in your environment or your behaviors that can help or hurt your sleep. So the steps to good sleep hygiene are 1, developing a routine. Everybody benefits from a routine. We talk about little kids having routines. Adults should have nighttime routines. It should happen about 20 to 30 minutes prior to bed. You do the same every single night before you get to sleep. You avoid bright lights, and you try to stick with it no matter what day of the week it is, and try to do it at the same time. This works on a subconscious level because your brain begins associating the steps of your routine with impending sleepiness and sleep opportunity. So you naturally start to actually feel sleepy during a nighttime routine. So it helps everybody. You want to avoid light. We'll talk more about the details behind that, but in short, your brain can't tell the difference between artificial light and sunlight. And sunlight is really what drives your circadian rhythm and tells your brain, hey, you should be feeling sleepy at certain times. So if you have light close to your face at nighttime or bright lights from your TV, your brain actually diminishes the amount of melatonin secretion and pushes back your bedtime for you. So you want to avoid light. Now, it's not as simple as just avoiding all light, because brightness does play a role. If you have to be exposed, for example, you're looking at patient records, you're on call, and it's all electronic medical record, the brightness of light is important. The brighter the light, the more likely it is to affect your melatonin secretion. And we're measuring light brightness in lux. So this room is probably about 250, 300 lux. If you go outside right now, it's probably about 50,000 to 100,000 lux. Nothing really beats the brightness from the sun. But lux, all the way down to 50 lux, has been shown to be able to suppress melatonin to a certain extent from your body, from your brain. A smartphone, turned up to its maximum brightness up to your face, can produce up to 400 lux of luminescence. So it can certainly diminish your melatonin secretion, which is a big problem for teenagers I see in clinic. The color of light is important. Many of you have probably heard about blue light filters, things that you can do on your phones. That helps. So if you take the blue light spectra out, that is the most offensive when it comes to your melatonin secretion. The problem is all the visible spectra do it to a certain extent that can diminish melatonin. So purple light and green light are the next biggest offenders. Yellow, orange, and red are less likely to decrease melatonin, but they all do it. So I tell folks using the blue light filters is a good step if you have to have a screen in front of you, but ideally just turning the device off is best. And then timing. The later you get at night, the more likely it is that the brightness is going to affect your melatonin secretion. And especially for really young people who like to stay up well past their bedtime, all that light they're consuming, the later they're getting it, the worse it is for your melatonin. Okay, so something to think about. And then as far as steps of good sleep hygiene, you want to avoid substances that are going to disrupt your sleep. So caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, all of these end up actually being sleep disruptors. Some of these may not surprise you, but alcohol you think of as, oh man, that helps me sleep. If I have a little nightcap, it makes me sleepy. And it's true, alcohol helps you fall asleep. But your body actually ends up withdrawing from alcohol during the night, withdrawing. And as you churn through the alcohol, it actually fragments your sleep, keeps you in lighter stages of sleep, and then you wake up earlier than you would have otherwise because your body has withdrawn from the alcohol. Particularly if you have like 2, 3, or more drinks, you'll wake up earlier. And you'll be tricked into thinking you have a little extra energy. Sometimes you wake up feeling, oh man, after a hard night of drinking, I got a pep in my step. I feel pretty good. That's that withdrawal phase where you're going from sedated to more awake. But as the day goes on, you realize that you actually haven't gotten good quality sleep because then you start to really struggle. So alcohol ends up being a net sleep disruptor. It does not help your sleep. And then I wanted to just focus a little bit on caffeine with hopes of not offending too many people here, just to tell you how many milligrams of caffeine are in the substances that we typically drink. Because the FDA doesn't make anybody label this, so they can keep it as a nice little secret. But it's important to know because this is the reason why people are kind of using these substances. And to put it in kind of a reference, 10 grams of caffeine is a lethal dose. If you ingested 10 grams of caffeine really quickly, you'd likely have cardiovascular shutdown and collapse and die. These doses are in milligrams, okay? So slightly different in milligrams, not grams. The clear sodas don't have any caffeine in them, so you can go to town when it comes to caffeine content. Probably not so great for sugar consumption, but from a caffeine standpoint, no problem. Decaf coffee, they have to take out a certain percentage to label it decaf, but it still has caffeine in it, about 5 milligrams, not that much. Milk chocolate, also not a big offender. An ounce of that has about 6 milligrams. Dark chocolate is 3 times worse than milk chocolate, so I really would advise you to avoid that late at nighttime. Your average can of Coke has about 35 milligrams. Mountain Dew, people love that buzz from Mountain Dew. It's because of the caffeine content, 55 milligrams. This is why Red Bull gives you wings. It's the caffeine content. Okay, it's not. People are talking about energy drinks. Like I have this energy. There's no ATP. There's no energy in these energy drinks. It's just gobs and gobs of caffeine to make you feel alert and awake. That's all these energy drinks are. But Red Bull has 80 milligrams of caffeine. They put other stuff in there like taurine and all these stuff to make you feel like you're getting energy, but you're really just getting caffeine. Coffee is better than a Red Bull. Coffee gives you wings because it has 110 milligrams of caffeine in it. Those little 2 ounces, 5-hour energy shots, you may have seen them if you're checking out the grocery store, 207 milligrams. You can drink it in like 2 sips, and it's like 2 cups of coffee. Widely abused by students. And then Starbucks. I don't know how they do it, but Starbucks has found a magical way of infusing their coffee beans with caffeine. And this is like their house blend, like Pikes Peak, or something like that. And again, it differs based on how they're brewing it, etc. But on average, 16 ounce of Starbucks coffee house blend has 550 milligrams of caffeine. Their stock price and the number of their stores has done really well over time, and this is the reason why. I mean, people love this stuff. It makes them feel really good. Then it's because of the caffeine. So if you drank 20 cups of Starbucks coffee really fast, you would die. That's a lethal dose. It's 10 grams. There was actually a case of I think it was a 14-year-old a few years ago who had ingested 3 caffeinated beverages. One was an energy drink, I think one was a coffee, one was a soda, and he died. And the coroner said, I can find no other reason that this child died apart from caffeine intoxication. And it was only about 500 or 600 milligrams of caffeine total that the child had ingested. No structural heart issues. Likely the child probably had an underlying propensity for arrhythmia nobody knew about. But still, there may be many people out there that have a propensity for arrhythmia that they don't know about. So caffeine is not a benign thing. All right, that wraps up sleep hygiene. Lots of steps for sleep hygiene. Number 2 is managing your sleep time. And this is, again, trying to change your perception about sleep. Many people say, I have a certain amount of things that I have to get done today, and if I don't get them done, gosh darn it, I'm just going to sacrifice sleep. And I tell people, try to reverse that philosophy and say, I have a certain amount of hours of sleep I need to get done. I'm going to work my day around that. Because at the end of the day, I feel like you end up being a more efficient person if you get the sleep that you need. You end up working better, you end up feeling happier. So everything, I think, improves if you're giving yourself the adequate amount of time to sleep. If you're going to take a nap, there's nothing wrong with naps, as long as you're not an insomniac at nighttime. Naps are fine. I usually say stick with less than 30 minutes, like a little power nap, or stick with 90 minutes, because that gives you an opportunity to go through a full sleep cycle. If you sleep somewhere in between, you may wake up out of deep sleep. And that's not to say that sleep still wasn't good for you. It'll pay off later on in the day, but you're going to wake up feeling really kind of crappy with like a headache and really kind of groggy because you're coming out of deep sleep. So. And then magically find some extra time in your day. I kind of put that in here because oftentimes I'm talking to residents and young crowds, and I say, it's amazing. We spend about the average adult spends 3 to 4 hours looking at their screen every day. That's probably some extra time you have in your day. The average teenager now is spending about 7 to 8 hours looking at a screen during the course of a day. There is time in your day to really carve out some extra time for sleep. And one of the main things, especially in academics, is we talk about email checking, perpetual email checking. There's this joke about academic medicine is a bunch of academicians sending emails back and forth until one of them gets tenure, saying sorry for your delayed response. Emails are just everywhere. It's just kind of what we do. I recommend people try to bin their email checking. Check it once in the morning, check it once in the afternoon. Don't keep it open. Try not to keep it on your phone, because nobody really needs that kind of access to you. Your time is important. Nobody needs that kind of access that they need to respond to an email right away and should have that kind of access to your time. And when you bin it, you'll probably find that magically the world is not imploding if it takes you 3 hours to get to an email. And you're likely going to be more productive, because every time you take your focus off of your task to check an email and then come back to your task, you've wasted multiple minutes just shifting your attention. And it's just not good for productivity. So find some extra hour in your day. Adjust your circadian rhythm. This is a little bit harder to do, but if you're a night owl, you want to avoid late night light. You want to get lots of bright lights in the morning, and you want to try to keep your schedule the same on the weekdays and weekends. Because if you have a tendency to shift your body clock, so if you have a tendency to stay up later than you should on a weekend, like the average teenager, instead of going to bed at 10, they go to bed at like 2 or 3 on the weekends, and they sleep until noon. If you do that, you then have to readjust your body clock and shift it earlier on Sunday night to go back to bed at 10 o'clock. And you can't do that. You can't adjust that quickly. So if you're asking a teenager who's going to bed at 3 to then go to bed at 10 o'clock on Sunday night, what you've asked them to do is essentially shift their body clock from Hawaii time to North Carolina or Virginia time overnight. And you can't do that. This is what jet lag is. You can't shift your body clock that quickly. And so I'm convinced that many teenagers are in a perpetual state of jet lag because of what they do to themselves over the weekend. They try to catch back up through the work week. They probably get close to where they need to be, and then they delay themselves all over again. So they're perpetually jet lagged and perpetually angry and upset because of it. If you're an early riser, if you're the type of person that doesn't need an alarm clock, you wake up at the same time no matter what time you went to bed, don't ignore those early signs of sleepiness. Your colleagues may be able to stay out at a social event longer than you, but they're also going to be able to sleep in longer the next morning. If you're a morning person, you don't have that luxury. You can't really sleep in. Your body clock wakes you up no matter what. So don't ignore those early signs of sleepiness. And then you want to screen for underlying sleep disorders. Half of adults that snore have sleep apnea, so that's a lot. You can have restless leg, those abnormal symptoms in your legs, creepy crawly feeling, pain that keeps you up. And then you can have insomnia as well. So lots of other underlying sleep issues that our trainees and ourselves can experience that can prevent you from sleeping well. Let's skip over this. Here, this is a challenge for you guys. I like to end with a challenge. 1 week, try this if you can. I beg you, please, just for 1 week. Try to give yourself 9 hours of in-bed sleep opportunity. It sounds crazy, but if you are an 8-hour sleeper, you likely will need a little bit more than 8 hours to start catching up. So I say give yourself at least 9 hours of in-bed sleep opportunity, if not more. No caffeine after 10 o'clock, and no screens for 30 minutes before sleep. And just see how the week goes. See how you feel at the end of the week. I'm asking just for 1 week out of your life. And the reason I say this is because I'm convinced that the majority of us are going through life in this semi kind of fog state because of sleep deprivation, not really kind of experiencing the colors as bright as they are, or the birds aren't singing as nice as they are. We're kind of walking zombies, many of us are. If you try this and you're like, wow, I actually feel a lot better. I can actually get through this whole chapter without dozing off and maintaining focus and attention. I've become a much more efficient worker and much more happy person at home. It might just change your perspective on sleep. So give me a week of trying this and see how things go. All right, let's wrap it up. Take-home points. 7 to 9 hours of sleep is what the average adult needs. No such thing as getting accustomed to less sleep. Sleep plays a vital role in fatigue, performance, and personal safety. Duty hours can only do so much. You got to take responsibility for your own sleep health and sleep timing. All right, I think we hopefully have some time for questions. Thank you very much for the attention, for staying awake. Appreciate it.
If anybody has any questions, you can feel free to ask. We know you all are on a time schedule, so if you need to leave, feel free to leave or stay after for some questions.
So I was always told that you can't compensate for a sleep deficit by like sleeping in on the weekend, and then I caught just the tail end of the news story on the radio the other day saying, no, that it's actually your sleep average over 7 days over a week that matters.
Yep.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so you can catch up to a certain extent. It depends really on how much of a sleep debt you've built up. The average teenager, it's been shown that based on how badly they sleep deprive themselves, even sleeping in on the weekends is not catching them up completely. So it all depends on your individual situation, how sleep deprived you are. The tricky thing is you're likely not going to be able to pay off all of your sleep debt quickly, because even though you may want to sleep for 14 hours straight and pay everything off, your circadian rhythm won't let you. It's going to wake you up in the morning at some point. Even if your brain still feels sleepy, that alerting signal is going to kick in and wake you up. So you can pay off only so much every single day. And it all depends on how sleep deprived you've been over the course of your life. The best way to do this, to test it, is to think to yourself how much sleep you think you need to feel fully refreshed, and then give yourself an extra half an hour of sleep opportunity and see how things go. And if you are paying off sleep debt, over time you'll find that you start waking up earlier and earlier and earlier, and hopefully get back to what your baseline need is. So that's the best way of testing. Give yourself a little bit extra time, and then slowly letting your body work itself back. And then it'll average out somewhere, like 8.5, maybe less. It'll average out somewhere, and that's where that's what your sleep need is. Yes?
What do you tell folks with pets that get them up?
Yeah, I tell them to get rid of the pet. No, I'm just kidding. I actually screen for this. It's one of my questions on my clinical intake, and I tell them that the pets have to be out of the room. And this is tough. It depends on the situation. I have children with autism that having a pet helps with anxiety, etc. And it's like, fine. There are always exceptions. But if you have the choice, close your door and keep your pet out of the room. Pets can be a big disruptor, not just because they like to jump on your bed and wake you up, etc. But they can stoke allergy issues. They can be loud, and there are actually sleep training books for dogs out there because there's such a problem with dogs not sleeping through the night. So it's a problem. So I tell them, please out of the room, and ideally a pet that doesn't make noise at night, and having them in a location that doesn't make noise. And if they can't, if there's something in the house that they can't avoid, there is going to be some noise, then having a background white noise machine can help drown out some of that background noise. That can be helpful too. Yes?
What about the little infants?
Yeah, what about infants? Yeah, kick them out of the room too. So infants, after they hit about 6 months of age, this is kind of bread and butter in my clinic, which is a lot of parent training when it comes to sleepiness. But there are effective solutions, and we didn't mention this, but I wrote a 50-page primer book on sleep problems in children, particularly focusing on infants and toddlers, because they're almost always a behavioral issue. There's almost always a behavioral solution. Sleep training is like the behavioral solution. There are multiple scientifically proven ways to sleep train a child, but the steps are actually pretty straightforward. And again, if you invite me back, I have a whole lecture on insomnia and how to take care of insomnia at different ages. But infants can be a challenge. The American Academy of Pediatrics now recommends that the infant stay in the parent room for 1 year of life, which the sleep doctors are kind of pulling their hair out. They're like, are you kidding me? Room sharing for a year? That's crazy. And now we're getting more and more literature that says that you probably don't need to keep them in your room that long. You need to kind of get them out. the longer they're in the room with you, the more likely they are to have other sleep issues, like sleep association disorder, where they need a caregiver to help them fall asleep, wake up in the middle of the night multiple times, and need help to fall asleep again. So there's this balance between the risk of SIDS, which is the AAP is trying to address, and the benefits of getting adequate and restful sleep. So the infant, depending on your family situation, I encourage you at 6 months, and sometimes even earlier, actually getting them out of the room and having their own sleep location.
We'll have that book that Dr. can talk about if you want a book for something.
It's so funny because, all these sleep books, I kind of joke. When I was doing research for my book, I knew all the sleep techniques. I already finished my sleep fellowship. But there's like these 300-400 page books, like Ferber and Wise, with all fantastic individuals and have great techniques. But like the books are like so dense, and I'm like a sleep deprived parent. I just had my first son. I'm like, just tell me what I need to know. Just tell me what I need to know, Dr. Weisbooth. Tell me what I need to know. Dr. Ferber, what's going on? So I just made a book that just lists out the techniques. Because all these books, your techniques really is like 4 lines. This is what the book's about. The publishers make them put 400 pages of stuff to sell a book. It's like 4 lines. So I just put the 4 lines in my book. This is what you have to do. Just make it easy. Sleep should be easy. That's my theory. Anything else?
If you have further questions, please feel free to stay for a few minutes and enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you have a restful sleep this evening.